They analyze the brains of people thinking about themselves in the future. And when we think about ourselves in the future, our brain actually reacts like we're seeing a stranger. And that for me was really helpful to understand because I was like, oh, we have no relationship with that future person.
I think when you hear futures, you are often drawn to think about chrome, shiny, like there's robots and there's flying cars. Everything is like glowing blue and you never see people, right? There's no humans there. What we're thinking about is futures you can see yourself in.
Welcome to Unmissables, a podcast about how leaders in product, design, and technology are building what's next, while navigating complexity, their creative ambitions, and the kinds of questions that rarely have easy answers, but always deserve better ones. I'm your host, Ariba Jahan, and on this show, we explore how we can build smarter and more intentional products, systems, and features. So let's get into it. So much of futures work stop at mood boards and trend decks that never leave the room. With imagery that feels robotic and truly disconnected from our real lives today, Radar is trying something different. It's a digital cooperative where imagination isn't just theory. They have spent the time to work in community to turn the concept of imagining better futures into practice through research, rituals, and a sense of shared ownership. I'm joined today by Keely Adler, the head of practice, and Caitlin Keeley, head of imagination at Radar. In this conversation, we talk about how they're prototyping futures in public, why optimism and rigor go hand in hand, and what becomes possible when communities treat imagination like real infrastructure. Hi, ladies. Welcome to the Unmissables podcast, Caitlin and Keely.
Thanks for having us.
Radar has evolved a lot since the first time I was involved in Radar. So I think a great place to start would be, could you guys break us down? What is Radar? I know Radar was a DAO-ish and a digital cooperative. Tell us all about Radar and what you both do there.
I love that you sort of set it up that way because we talk about it almost as like this living, breathing organism. And we often say things we talk about will fall away and then they'll come back at the right time when their emergence is due. So this podcast is due.
The emergence.
It is. So Radar is a collective, a community of 300-ish people, curious humans from around the world. Some are professional futurists. Some are just curious strategists. They're dot connectors. They're artists. They're people of all types who are just interested in the idea of better futures and how we can sort of come together and co-create them and sort of have collective ownership over a community, but also over the pathway that we're sort of charting together toward these better futures. So yeah, it takes a lot of different iterations and it is sort of this nebulous organism that shape shifts over time. But at the core, we're a community of curious people who hang out and make things together and build toward better futures.
I was just going to say too, we are all united by our mission, motto, whatever, that the future belongs to those who think about it. I've pointed out in the past that I think this is also related to our Web3 roots, but everybody shares a common idea that maybe things could be different. And we are all interested in one way or another, talking about it, experimenting with it, making it, seeing how that might come to be,
How do you guys define futures?
So I think it stems from a lot of our collective personal experiences with futures and foresight work. I think when you hear futures, you are often drawn to think about chrome, shiny, like there's robots and there's flying cars. Everything is like glowing blue and you never see people, right? There's no humans there.
We're just not going to exist.
Right. Like it's not very grounded. And I think that that's one of the things that we've always talked about, when we do world building, when we do different things, what we're thinking about is futures you can see yourself in, futures you can, wear your favorite sweater in or picture your auntie in. If you can't imagine a better future and actually see yourself living in it, you're never going to actually be able to like work toward that. And for me, my day-to-day title is cultural futurism. And I think there's a lot of like professional futurists who sort of cringe at the modifier, but the modifier is really intentional because there's an anecdote I love about how we could predict cell phones. Like we go way back and we look at sort of futures predictions of old. We could predict cell phones, but we could not predict women in the workplace. And it's because we could predict, we can think about technology. We can think
God
about
forbid
like
a girl wants to do work. Oh my
we
goodness.
can think about the shift of like the mechanics and the technology, but like people and context. And at the end of the day, all the future is how we each collectively react and respond to shifting contexts. And so that's, I think, a really important part of the way that we think about the future at Radar. And also, I think something that Caitlin's really brought to our perspective on collective imagination and how we envision futures together.
I really like that we use the term mundane futures. I think that's been a super helpful lens for people because it's true, like Keely said, we've been served these slick tech boy sci-fi. We all love Star Trek, but it's deep and it's not that real, you know? And I also was super inspired by this research. They analyzed the brains of people thinking about themselves in the future. And when we think about ourselves in the future, our brain actually reacts like we're seeing a stranger. And that for me was really helpful to understand because I was like, oh, we have no relationship with that future person. And I think the same can be said about our relationship with the future because it's so sleek, because there's, like Keely said, no humans in it. It's very hard to imagine. So we do a lot of work bringing texture, realness, real people to those futures. And our, what we refer to as multiplayer mode is a huge part of that because one person isn't really capable of imagining reality, right? It takes all of us and adding texture. And you're like, this is what the coffee shop might be like. And I'm like, this is whatever. And together, and we do this exercise, collaging the future. Together, we can piece together something that has a much richer texture than just one sci-fi guy, you know?
It's always a guy.
Yeah, in fact, actually. Yeah.
It's interesting, right? Because you're also talking about the expectation that has been set by language around future studies as well as visualization and the aesthetic of what future is, right? Like from young age, we have seen that sleek robotic imagery that you just talked about, Keely, and what it made it feel like is that we're not supposed to be in the future. So if we're not supposed to be in the future, then how dare I imagine myself in the future, right? So what you guys are also talking about is if the future truly belongs to the people that think about it, that means it can belong to us, right? That
think about what you either have shiny tech futures or you have like deep dark dystopias. Zoe Scaman always talks about and so many people write about this, the idea that like the stories that make money are dystopias, and so we are conditioned to keep producing those, which is why there's actually all of these really fascinating sort of startups and things working on more sort of hopeful hope punk visions of the future. And what does it mean to like create media in that ecosphere to like retrain our brains to imagine futures in a different light?
I mean, the fact that hope is a rebellious act, right? The reclaiming of hope is rebellious, is just tells everything. Before we dive more into like futures as a practice within Radar, I'd love to talk about the digital cooperative part, right? Caitlin, I think you mentioned imagining as a collective and like collaging together and putting things together. Talk to me more about that community aspect of it. How is Radar different from other communities or from the language of what we think a community is, right?
I mean, how are we different? I know how we're awesome. I think there's a lot of things. I think one of the things that is like really vivid about Radar for me is truly the energy. There is a collective sense of enthusiasm. And I think that mutual enthusiasm is what helps us build all kinds of things and create a space where we can do those things. You know, we live in a Discord, but we also have IRL chapters all around the world. And yeah, I mean, Keely and I are always looking at different ways that we'll come together in community. Recently, we started doing this collective digestion, which is weekly, just like we hang out, and that's been a really, really neat way to kind of do the things we do async in channels, but with voices and humans.
Yeah, and Caitlin mentioned briefly Web3, which I don't know, like, in terms of the people listening to this, like how many people hear that and like cringe and go like NFTs and like, I get it.
I know it has asterisks.
And we're not that, but we are born of that in a way.
Yeah.
From
and the ethos of that, right?
From
The
a values
culture and the
perspective.
principles. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. When we talk about sort of the founding of Radar and the values that are embedded in it, we talk about sort of the three fundamentals of ownership, of this sort of combination of emotional, social, and financial ownership. And I'll put an asterisk on financial because we're not a community that's raking in cash. But, in the event that we did, we are a cooperative in that way.
Set up
so
for that, right?
We are set up for that. We are, shared ownership in that way. But I don't want to underestimate the value of social and emotional ownership. The social ownership comes from just the fact that we are very much all coming together in this community and we're building things together. And, when we talk about that idea of like instigation and the fact that, an idea can come from anywhere, not in sort of an ad agency way, but in a genuine, someone can say something in any channel of the server and like weeks later we could be like building that idea, or we could just be like in a collective digestion session and like things just happen, things just emerge because of that sort of effervescent spirit and that layered enthusiasm over the mission of Radar. We have this sort of social shared ownership over the things that we do together and the mission. And then emotionally, that idea of the futures that we're imagining together, part of that is, when you're collectively imagining a better future, think about, a future in sync was the first one we worked on, or a more playful future. What you're doing is you're sort of deeply researching this future. You're feeling into that future together. You're, crafting these narratives about what that future looks and feels and why we can see it sort of popping up through the cracks in the fabric around the world. What you're ultimately creating is this emotional stake in, I want to live there.
Yeah.
I want to be there. That is a better future than where I am now. And I would like to go there. And so when you create that sort of emotional stake, that's another really powerful form of ownership. So when you bring those three types of ownership together, emotional, social, and financial ownership, you really create this ability to like have people feel a sense of agency and buy-in and just like something different than Radar's not for networking, right? Like a lot of people, when you throw the word community out there, it's like, it's just people coming together and it's sharing contacts, it's sharing information. There's just something about Radar that's always gone a few layers deeper than that. And I think a little bit of that is just like the magic of Radar. I think it's been there since Fancy, our founder, sort of started the community, and it's always sort of felt a little different. But there's also, I think, the mechanics of it, that really intentional sort of three-part structure does create something really meaningful for people.
Yeah, I think a few things stand out to me. One is just because you bring a group of people together doesn't mean it's a community, right? That's one. Two, having a stake in the vision that you are imagining and then realizing that you can't go there alone. Right? It takes a collective to create that future, right? And I think by pulling a group of people together, that is, I'm going to dare to imagine because I have the right to imagine because the future belongs to me. I want a future for myself. And then collaborating in a meaningful way to thinking about not only imagining that, but then bringing it to reality. I feel like those are some really unique differentiations as well in the way that you guys approach future. So when we think about digital cooperatives or other organizations that are trying this shared ownership, are there other examples you guys have come across?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much experimentation in this space. I think that's what's really exciting. And I think it's one of the things that we genuinely appreciate about sort of the Web3 space. And it's not all sort of like rooted in crypto. It's rooted in that sort of notion of what if we tried something different? So whether it's like what Yancey Strickler's doing with Meta Label, or Austin Roby is experimenting with a co-owned sort of version of Bandcamp called Subvert that has absolutely nothing to do with crypto. That's a really beautiful thing. Other Internet is a research collective that I think is no longer, but they're putting out a book that sort of looks back at their sort of shared explorations and their shared sort of research over the years. So there's a lot of experiments in this space that are just in that interest of what if we could try something otherwise, and what could that teach us about the way that we do things now and the way that we could do things differently.
I think I was going to say too, we've met a lot of people, and people come through Radar too, who've worked in the triangle. Do you know what I mean? And they know what that feels like. They know what that looks like, and they know where profits go, And I think that there's an interest in trying to work in different ways, trying to build things that are perhaps as more sustainable, to build things that don't stress creators out, to build things. And I think that is some of the energy that we see in Radar is, okay, we often reference this little chart that Austin Kleon drew based on the Genius. That's how do we move from this ecosystem to an ecosystem, right? So yeah, there's a lot of very cool experimentation. And I think it reflects that in so many different ways, people are looking at systems and they're not serving us, right? So what else is possible? What makes things flourish?
I haven't read everything about it yet, but I came across this organization called Social Co-op and a Meat Co-op. The Social Co-op they exist on Mastodon. It's an instance on a server in Mastodon, but they also then have other ways of getting together. And it was really interesting. They have a wiki page about how they operate, their governance, and they are really about how do we create a social space where we create the rules and the governance around it. And they originated back in 2017 with the buyback Twitter campaign that happened. So I think that was interesting. And then I have no idea what a Fediverse is. That's where I stopped reading. Do you know what a Fediverse is?
That's the whole decentralized social.
Okay.
So when you look at and I only know enough to be dangerous to talk about this, but when you look at Blue Sky, when you look at Mastodon, when you look at what it means to, have the ability to not have your Twitter feed functionally just live on Twitter, but have it actually be transmutable between, it could live anywhere on the Fediverse, right? Threads, in theory, would be cooperative among Fediverse instances. They're not all connected right now, but that is the theory, is that it's decentralized social, that you own your data in more of a sort of distributed way, rather than it all sort of being owned by name your man.
So interesting. And then this other organization I came across called Meat Co-op. Meat as an MEE.
I did hear MEAT.
I heard
the
MEAT.
first time you heard it, and I was like, is it like a farmer's market vibe? Like, what are we doing?
I was like,
that
it's hot dog DAO.
That would be cool. Apparently, it's an organization. I mean, it's an organization where they provide like online meeting and conferencing tools, but it's powered by renewable energy and it's running on cooperatively owned infrastructure. And they have dedicated servers that you can use. And again, it goes to the element of like, you should be able to own your own data instead of being limited to whatever platforms and technology you're on.
There's also a cooperative that's competing with like Uber, right? Like there's like workers cooperative media that's growing. Like the idea of, Web3 aside, like cooperatives aren't new, like the idea of going back to the return of the cooperative, whether it's to fight sort of platform primacy or to think about what does it mean to return profits to workers, or to think about the well-being economy, and to just think about systems in new and different ways. There's a lot of people experimenting with this in really interesting ways.
Definitely. So I know you both also have other hats that you wear outside of Radar. How does this work intersect with your client work or freelance work or any other work you do outside of Radar?
So for me, and I think for a lot of people who join Radar, you get burnt out in institutional land. Caitlin and I both come from advertising. I still work in advertising. I do cultural futurism at Dentsu Creative. The way that I like to think about it, beyond the inspiration, because of course it's that, right? They're like this symbiotic relationship. But what happens is a lot of the people who are drawn to Radar are drawn here because they want more, right? They want to not just sell things to people. They want to make a difference. They want to build things that matter. They want to have an impact on the future. And they often feel all they're doing is writing decks that, sit in somebody's inbox and don't often have impact. And I think we all feel that, right? The other thing is that it's often easy to feel in institutional hallways. You can't always go there, right? You can't go to the negative place. You can't go to the real place.
The weird place.
You can't go to the weird place, right? Like you can't go necessarily where you would explore if you had free reign, right? So Radar becomes this place, this playground where you can go to all the places, right? When you look at our first 3 reports, they go everywhere, right? They go to the ends of every bound of the topic that we're exploring. And I think that's really special for people because we don't shy away from anything. And from a process perspective too, we open ourselves to, you want to try something? You want to throw a workshop that's just something you've never done before, but you're curious about it? Yeah, let's do it. You just allow yourself to experiment in different ways. You allow yourself to go different places. And then you get to bring that back, right? So it's not just bringing inspiration back. It's also bringing an ability to, how far can I push? How far can I widen that triangle? How far can I push the bounds of what is okay in an institutional landscape? How far can I push my clients? How far can I push my teams in an interest of wanting to make more impact where, let's be real, the dollars are and the ability to do things at scale are. So that ability to not just be inspired, but also bring a little bit of fuel to the fire over here. So they're symbiotic in a lot of different ways.
What I'm also hearing is there is the magic and the imagination and finding a place where you could let your brain be free. But also I'm hearing a lot of rigor because you guys are talking about experimentation, creation, and that takes rigor to do the research and then bring it to life and bring it to life in a way where you're intentionally learning from it. So let's talk about the infrastructure, the practice of imagining, if you will. So what does multiplayer imagination mean and how do you operationalize?
It's meaned a lot of different things over the course of Radar. And that's what's special about it, right? It's not like you're feeding into a system that's going to exist in one way, right? In our first year, for instance, we developed a really unique sort of 12-week research cycle that was born of a super curation process that was, okay, so we're going to figure out sort of a way to multiplayer mode collectively vote on what has the most energy coming out of the server so that we can decide what topics we even want to pursue, right? And then we can figure out, what does it mean to, yes, have a project team that's going to be sort of responsible for research, but then have full community engagement over the course of a 12-week research project, from sort of like diving deep into secondary research, to doing primary research in really interesting new ways around the world, to collective imagination workshops, to sort of how do we find those moments to almost like bring a sort of multiplayer, cohesive sort of choice point into the process at different moments to ultimately surface these incredible report objects. And so that was sort of the first year, and each of those reports spun out into either a hackathon or a public call for ideas to bring the future to life. So we've always experimented with different modes of bringing people in. In the second year, it looked a lot, I guess the second summer, it looked a lot like these campfire moments where they were more intimate in scale. And, we had different members of the community raise their hand and say, this topic is really interesting to me. I want to throw that in the ring. And then we, voted on the best ones and we pulled those each month and we did a different topic. But then speaking of emergence, as sort of the year played out, we were like, all feeling so drawn to this one topic. And A Future in Love was born, and it took over the last 3 months of the year. And we were just like, let's go all in. Let's throw Love Fest. Let's just spend the end of this year in a really potent moment where, countries world over were in election moments. Let's really lean into that moment. And then, fast forward to this year, and it took a totally different shape. Rather than looking at the sort of what of better futures, which we had spent so much time in, we decided to pivot and think about how. And now we're in these sort of experimental labs. So, it's all in an effort to work toward better futures, but there isn't any one shape. It's all really sort of thoughtful explorations of different methodologies that we're always, there's a channel for nerds in the server called Let's Get Meta. There are some people who are comically notoriously scared of it, but it's my favorite channel in the server. But I think we're just always constantly inspired by, what if we thought about things this way? What if we thought about things this way? Could we do this? What would it look for us to do this? And we've never done it before, but we're going to try it and figure it out. A little bit of a roundabout answer and doesn't sound super rigorous, but I think it ultimately is an expression of just like experimenting with different forms and playing with different forms and sort of mashing things up along the way.
I mean, I hear rigor. I mean, I think rigor doesn't have to mean so much structure that you don't know what you're allowed to do. I think what I'm also hearing is there's clarity in roles and processes, just enough for people to understand what they can do, how they can provide, how they can collaborate, right? So I think it feels like Radar has to constantly balance tension points. How do you create space for imagination versus also logistics? Okay, on this channel versus we're going to meet here on this board, or how are we doing research in an ethical way? How are we capturing and documenting for accuracy, but also then collectively digesting it as a community and synthesizing. And, so it feels like you guys are having to pull those in a really interesting way so that there's space for both. I'm also hearing there's the collective building, but enough of solo thinking that you also have to allow so people can kind of percolate and think about what's emerging for them, right?
Mm-hmm. Caves and campfires.
Yeah, and we're all on different time zones too, a lot of us. So I think, a lot of us have really figured out ways that work for working async and connecting. And we've also too, it's interesting the way you say there's rigor in making space, because we've definitely talked about that balance between a familiarity in the things that we do, so people aren't always kind of untethered and disoriented, but then also not just always cookie cutty patterning things, because we want to be intentional, not just what we're thinking about, but the ways that we're thinking about. So often we will model or invent the ways that we're working is reflective of what we're researching, So we tried to be, like I wrote a love letter to the community to kick off Future in Love. And then I was handwriting journal entries and sharing them. Do you know what I mean? So during Future in Sync, there were people who were touching grass, not just saying it. Do you know what I mean?
I was going to say we built a massive multiplayer playground inside of a Miro board during a more playful future. And it is the crowning achievement, I think. It's a glorious thing. You can build Legos in there. You can do I Spy in there. You can play arcade games.
Yeah.
All inside of Miro. And I just think it's one of the greatest things that's ever happened.
We definitely push the limits of Miro.
Thanks for listening to Unmissables. We've just relaunched, and I'd love your help in bringing more listeners to the show. If this conversation has sparked something new for you, take a minute to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star rating on Spotify. It really does help people find us. Thank you so much. Future in Love was one of your most recent publication, and there was a larger experiment around it where you guys also had funding to give away, right, to people that pitched projects. What was, from running that experiment, I think you said it was 3 months, what surfaced that surprised you? And what did it teach you about designing from desire, from love, from incorporating so much of an emotional provocation?
So what's interesting is actually it was our first cycle that we decided not to do a published report, because we decided that in the effort to embody the topic, what was more of an embodiment of a future in love than to hold an all-day celebration of a future in love and to bring people together for this moment and to do something really embodied. So we had an embodied side quest, and we had a creative side quest, and we had a spiritual side quest, and we did all of these things in an effort to sort of have people really like feel into a future in love rather than intellectualize a future in love. So that's one of the things I would say. And then the other thing is just how resonant it is. And I think what's cool is that every cycle we've done somehow connects back to our very first topic of a future in sync. And I think a future in love has really struck that same chord where it's like, it's everything, right? It's not, in no way was that a report about relationships or romance or friendship or connection. It was a report about love as infrastructure for life, right? Love as a public good, as a way of being, as a way of building, whether it's in urban planning or in approaching our relationship with nature, with governance, whether you use that language or not. You have movements happening around the well-being economy. You have movements happening around citizening as a verb. All of these
Mutual aid.
all of these things are flavors of what would happen if you put love at the foundation of everything that we do. And I think it was really interesting. It's almost, I sort of view it as almost a bookend to a future in sync in a way. And I think that it just in the aftermath hit so many chords. And it was, I mean, it was planned with timing on purpose. We hosted Love Fest a week after the election, and we knew that it could go
And
either
then
way.
made it free.
And then we made it free for everyone because we needed it. And we knew that that was a possibility. And, you know, we ended up having speakers that really just like really spoke to the moment. Ismani Arboleda was our keynote, and we had some really beautiful panels, and the side quests just came to be. And it just ended up being this really wonderful celebration that I think touched a lot of people. And now I can sort of feel it. Like it really did spawn our 2025.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit more about that, because I know you were saying how there's a natural shift that's happening into what is the mission of 2025.
Yeah. Caitlin,
Yeah, I
do you
mean,
wanna?
yeah, for sure. I was going to say too, it's true. It was so radical to decenter romantic love. I think just so many people, when we tuned into that, we were like, it's been commodified and centered, and there are so many different types of love that are out there that are valuable for us, you know? And even I remember we had amazing park designs and whatever just coming up in conversation built on love, but there was an amazing thread that was going about the energy of flirting and what happens when you bring that flirting energy to being out in the world, to meeting people, to trying new things, to like, you know what I mean? And I think perhaps it was Future in Love that planted our awareness of yearning in culture. You know, we could see it trending as a word and a meme and a feeling, you know? But again, because we had spent so much time decentering the idea of romantic love, I think we could notice the way yearning was existing in our community, in our futures practice, in the world around us as something much larger than having an unrequited crush, you know? And I think so, like those things were swirling around from Future in Love. And then I think for us, the genesis of this year too was we talked a lot about hope. You know, we made a radio station broadcasting hope called Tomorrow Radio. It was very like at the front for us and a lot of people. So, you know, Keely and I were asking ourselves, okay, so this is everywhere. What's post hope, right? What comes after that? And we knew there had to be action, but we could sense in ourselves and we could see it when we would imagine these futures with people. You know, we've done it many times. And Keely said, we've cultivated these vivid futures together with texture and our favorite sweaters and all of that. And we can see it and we're like, yes, you know, let's move there. But there was a deep sense of, but how? And I think that a lot of the stress and apathy and uncertainty that people have is like power structures are
Digging in.
yeah, right? It feels almost like the more we dream, the more these systems are lock it down, And so that gave us this awareness of this yearning gap, right? This distance between where we feel stuck today and where we want to go tomorrow. And I feel like I could pass to Keely then, because you had that amazing conversation that sort of awakened that language for us around our boats.
Yeah, no, I think I told Ariba this, but I was talking to, she was a new member at the time, and she's in the UK, and she was talking to me about how when she pictures yearning, she pictures someone standing on the British side of the English Channel, staring longingly into France. And she was like, I just want to shake them and be like, but there are boats and planes and there are vehicles.
You can
for
go
you.
there.
You can go there, and it just had us thinking, what if that was what we explored this year, right? We've done the job of painting these really vivid pictures of the future. And we know that, there are plenty of examples of the cracks in the fabric in the world and the examples that are out there that, it's possible, that it's happening, that it's not evenly distributed, but it's out there, right? We've done that. We've invited people to build it with us. What if we took a different tack? What if we invited people to find new ways to cross that gap? And that is really what we decided to do for 2025. And it's been interesting because it's different and it's a little heady. But the idea of and I think Ariba and I joked about it, just do the thing. You can just do the thing. What if, there's a meme of the owl side by side, like figure 1, figure 2, and it's like how to draw an owl, and figure 2 is this atomically perfect owl, elaborately drawn owl, and figure 1 is 2 circles, and it's like how to draw an owl. And what we realized was, okay, people can't draw the owl, so there is this chasm. How do we fill in the steps between the 2 circles and the fully drawn owl? And how do we do that in new ways, right? Old keys won't open new doors. So how do we find new ways across the gap? And so we built out these 3 yearning labs across the total year of 2025 at a very leisurely pace, talking about anti-burnout protocols. And so we're exploring strange ways and small things right now, ways of crossing the gap.
How do you fill that gap? Because the whole time I'm like, okay, and now reveal the answer. How do you fill that gap?
We're experimenting, but I think
talk about fables.
Well, I was going to say fables. We've getting really hyped about cultural acupuncture. We were talking before about that sense of agency and ownership we are strengthening that collective sense that change does happen. We are looking at history. Hey, look, these things changed in this amount of time. And by doing that together, there is a sense that as a community, we're strengthening that sense of agency. So yeah, Keely mentioned one of the things that we have found that is looking super interesting as a boat is fables. So taking these ideas of better futures and then distilling them back into the values that make them possible. For example, I think we're all aware that we're plagued by individualism, right? So what are ways that we can tell ourselves stories of collectivism, the power, but in ways that actually travel in culture, right? Because research reports and cool keynote decks, they're traveling for only a certain group of people. And I think that we are very interested in how we make those ideas connect for ourselves, but then also how can we get them out into culture in a way that I can talk about it with my neighbor and they don't think I'm in a cult, or maybe they think I'm that kind of thing. So I think a lot of us have seen how impactful brand work can be in culture to shift conversation, to change ideas of how things are, So I think you see a lot of people too being, okay, if we're trying to get everyone to work towards these futures, we we know we have some of these skills. What might those look like in other forms, right?
I saw you make a face at cultural acupuncture, and that's really what we're describing here, right?
I want to hear more about it. Yeah.
So one of the interesting case studies is back in I want to say it's the 80s. My timeline might be off, but Cheers.
It's okay. Say a decade.
When Cheers was on, so Harvard, the School of Public Health, they worked with Mothers Against Drunk Driving to get the idea of designated drivers into sitcom scripts. So you had, an episode of Cheers that featured the idea of a designated driver that wasn't just like organic. It was what we're calling cultural acupuncture. This idea that you can make a small, sort of very targeted, thoughtful impact that really opens something up in culture in a big way. And you're seeing there's a lot of, whether it's Climate Spring or there's a handful of other organizations that do this work with getting climate storytelling into popular media. And, we think about it, what if we could do a stand-up class where we're getting people to, basically this is what comedy is. If anybody saw Amy Poehler's commentary on generational views on money, it's basically this. But why is it that this institution has done things in this really messed up way for the last century? That kind of thing, that's just observational humor.
Yeah.
Is a way of pointing out that something is wrong and it could be better. Imagine that you could have a Sims mod pack that was the Future and Love edition. That's the sort of collective living anti-nuclear family version of The Sims. That's totally viable and a way of getting people to think about the world in a different way, but not coming through the lens of like 100-page deck about the future of X.
Yeah, I mean, you're also talking about power structures here, right? Who are we saying gets to author this 100-page deck about the future versus who's the receiver versus in this conversation, we're talking about how do we turn some of these storytelling into actually modes of invitation, right? You're using storytelling as a way to invite people to say, hey, come and join this, not a cult, but come and join. And create this future as well, question it, the things that
see it differently.
See it differently, right?
I often find, I was going to say too, like I often find that giving the example of Star Trek is like the most compelling for people to understand why we say the future belongs to those who think about it. Because I'll give the example of like, look, like we all saw that and like now we have iPads, Now we have 3D printers. Well, a lot of our conceptions of the future were baked into the collective imagination by something like that. One example. And so what I say to people is imagine if we were all doing that. Imagine if we were all thinking about that together and coming up with it, then we can live in a future that we all imagine together, And that's when you can see people start to understand why we're so hyped on imagination and why we believe it's so radical,
Yeah, the imagination and then the follow through of taking an action towards it, or else there's a little bit of a yearning burnout that can happen. I read a LinkedIn post earlier. I can't remember it verbatim, but it was just talking about what the industries often highlight as best of class versus the constructs and the conditions you have to work within and the delta between it. And I commented on that post and said, this is essentially the root of creative burnout, because what happens is we have these idealized and idolized concepts that take up stages, that take up these book spaces. And then you go to work and you're like, can't do that.
Oh, that's my budget and that's my time.
That's how many rounds of revisions. That's what you actually meant, even though the first call was very visionary. So I think you've got that creative burnout that constantly happens. And then, what we're talking about is yearning burnout.
It is.
We're gonna make that a phrase, because I think as you're describing the future,
you might call it yearn out.
Yearn out. Okay. Yes. I'm feeling this physical need to be like this, right? I want to touch this future that we're talking about. And I think there is a cognitive dissonance between the concept of future versus what we're talking about. The future can be a year from now. Future isn't just about
the future can be today.
Taking over. Future can be today. Future can be an hour from now. Right. Exactly.
I think yearn out comes from the idea that this step has to be a big one, right? It has to be
That's what I was gonna
substantial.
say.
We have to make, it's even our next month, June, we're exploring small things. Small.
Yep.
Does change have to happen at scale, or can it come through small experiments? And I think that's like, we're all in the world of like commenting on LinkedIn posts, but we were talking about in another post about how one of the other stigmas around futures work is that it removes people from thinking about the present. But one of the, I think, most radical things about thinking about the future is that it's just a way of disrupting the way you think about the present, right? Whether it's in the way that what's possible in the present, right? Whether it's how I'm talking to clients, it affects the actions you take today and tomorrow, or yourself. It's a way to disrupt how you think about right now. So I think that's one piece of it. And the other piece of it is it doesn't have to be a gigantic step. It can be the conversation that you have with your neighbor. It can be like, instead of the doom scroll, it's the article you read or the book you pick up. You don't have to cross the yearning gap in one fell swoop.
Right.
Like, you take what you can. And I think that's a really meaningful difference. But multiplayer mode helps with that too, because if you feel like you're doing it alone, you're not. That gap is an uncrossable chasm.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I think a lot of us too find hope in the mycelial idea of change, that things, networks, and we are all an important part of it, whether it's like a conversation we're having, whether it's a sticker we designed and like put on a pole, all of those little things happen. And in Hope in the Dark, she talks about this idea. We tend to think of, for example, like gay marriage got legalized because a judge decided it, but there were thousands and thousands of tiny moments and momentums that happened before that were really, really important. You know what I mean? Someone talked to like an uptight uncle. Somebody made a little zine and gave it to somebody, and all of those things matter. And I feel that flavor is very rich in like the things we're doing in Radar. We're not just like, well, we are making stickers, but we're instigating conversation and all of that stuff. It is a very, very important part of agency. And for me,
100%.
makes me feel useful.
Sometimes our merch line is like, I forget what it says exactly, but it's like sometimes the thing that creates change is a tote bag. Like, it's can be silly. But I think that she brought up Hope in the Dark. That's a Rebecca Solnit book. And I think all of Rebecca Solnit's writing does a beautiful job of saying history would love to tell you that like institutions have created change, or that, that activism doesn't create change, that people don't create change, institutions create change. And she does a wonderful job of illustrating how, in fact, small things and people over time do in fact create change because they have agency in their actions, and it just gets erased over time and we forget.
I feel like you're naturally already talking about this, but one thing I really wanted to ask you guys is, where do you think this multiplayer collaboration, multiplayer imagination is going next? Or what do you hope more leaders do from hearing about this?
I mean, I see in culture and in agencies and places where ideas get made, spreading of or a moving past the like own hero narrative. And this idea that individuals, geniuses, like are the people who make things happen. I really see that going away, whether it's with a rise of collectives or the way that people make ideas. That to me is super, super important. It's multidisciplinary collaboration. I think that the multiplayer idea is really just finding ways to open up to the perspectives of others and to integrate more than the singles that we've been serving,
Yeah. I'm interested in what AI has to do with that too. If you think about the impact on middling creativity is what it's probably going to be. The video stuff that just came out this week is bonkers.
Insane.
It's completely insane. I think that, the magic of humanity is only multiplied. I mean, of course, in multiplayer mode, I think there is something really special that happens when humanity mixes with humanity. And maybe that is the difference. Maybe that is what separates in a sort of AI fueled creative industry. But that's pure speculation and intrigue.
Yeah, I was at a dinner, and the icebreaker question was about which AI hardware we would kill or make love to.
Fuck, marry, kill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Mary
just found
Claude. Mary Claude.
Mary Claude. But I mean, they gave very specific options. But it was so interesting that that was the icebreaker. I'm like, right, that's where we are, you know. And I think that's the reality, and not a bad reality. It's just that it is everywhere, and it is infused into the things we're touching, the things we're making, the things we're dreaming up, right? Like maybe there are people who has never dared to imagine that much until they started a ChatGPT conversation and said, "Hey, what if?" So we don't really know. What is one unexpected lesson Radar taught you about building futures in this tension between imagination, but also like research and all of this?
What happens when you just talk to friends about ideas? So many of us in creative industries, and I think especially in strategy, and there's a hell of a lot of strategists in Radar, end up solo. Like we're the only person diving down the rabbit hole. We're barely talking to other strategists. We're hardly having conversations about stuff.
What do you think that is?
Well, I mean, part of it is that resources are fewer and fewer and fewer and farther between, right? But also, I think it's always my whole career. It's sort of been that way. You know, it's just rarer for there to be a larger team, and it's less likely for creatives work in pairs. Strategists don't. And I think just the magic of riffing with people and batting things around and what emerges when ideas clash. It's not an unexpected lesson, but it really hits you that it's something special. And the other thing I would say, and I think I've told this to a lot of people, is the potent reminder of impact doesn't have to be big, that just the conversation that you have with someone, the conversation that you have with a client, the conversation that you have with your neighbor. We had a person in our community share the report with her nurse practitioner after a Future in Sync. Those little things add up and they matter. So even if that project or that deck you wrote didn't go through, it didn't make a difference, it didn't cause some innovation, you planted a seed in someone's brain that affected the next conversation they had, affected the next job they took, it's all pollen. And that's kind of refreshing.
Yeah, I would say everything that Keely said for sure. And like, we had our F around and find out mascot last year, but I really do think it's the era to F around and find out, And I think that because many of us have come from places where we have to be like goal oriented, we have to like deliver a specific thing, and like to get a team there, like we have to know what the finish line is. But in Radar, like many, many times, like we've been like, I don't know, we're in it, and we're, there's like a little bit of gentle chaos, and like there's a little bit of like playful experimentation, and we don't know what's going to come out of it, but we're like down to clown, And what has happened over and over and over again in Radar, and that has been a really beautiful lesson too, is things have come out that we could not have written or predicted if we had just sat in a room and been, okay, 6 months out, we're going to do this. Like last year from a micro grant, a musician from Nigeria, right? He wrote a track so beautiful for a micro grant that when we heard it for the first time, we literally wept, And the chorus is "The future belongs to those who think about it." And, we, again, thinking of the micro grants because
like
often
this.
they...
Accident. We wrote a book by accident.
We did write a book by accident.
Does.
Honestly, we did though, because we kept laughing that the origin story was, oops, it's not a zine, because we had done a speculative fiction project with Meta Label, and they had really liked it and been like, hey, do you want to do something? Keely had written an outline, and I was like, that's not an outline, that's a table of contents. And then we were like, we doing this? But again, different people came into that process. We had once again an insane Miro. And we were in a multiplayer flow state,
And then we shipped it to 22 countries. Accident book.
Yeah.
Book. So, okay. So given, I mean, look, the container, the environment that you guys have nurtured, that fancy kind of put the vision forward from the beginning, it's very special. I think we can all agree that that level of specialness is super unique to Radar. For people that are listening and they're like, if I could just touch that or bring a little bit of that into my organization, what's a way they can approach or bring a little bit more co-design, a little bit more multiplayer, a little bit more of this magic into their organization? And I ask that knowing you both kind of have to coexist between the Radar magic, but also working in corporate, working with brands and clients and all of that.
I have two things. One is psychological safety, just some like openness and willingness to just be your entire self in all of it. Right. I think we joke but it's wholly true. Radar's a very neurodiverse space. The openness of that is very telling, and it creates a certain environment, but we're like very vulnerable with each other. And I think that, we talk a lot at Dentsu about, when a pitch feels really good, when it goes really well, it's because you have a team where there has been an environment of psychological safety. And when it goes badly, that's not there. So I think that makes a big difference. And then the other thing that I've brought in is Miro. The low pressure, like, I don't need you to make me slides. Just drop me some cool shit inside of Miro. Write some stuff on stickies. Drop some links. Send me some inspiration and do that inside of a Miro.
Yeah.
It's kind of a difference maker.
Yeah.
I get that.
Honestly, +1 cosign for psychological safety. It really is, though. There's like, in order to be relaxed, I can say this as a creative person and someone who's been responsible for making ideas for a long time, your shoulders need to drop in order to be able to actually like innovate and create and be free. Like, non-linear suggestions, coming up with the types of things that like AI can't, requires essential humanness. And that is being like safe, that is being playful, that's being like well rested. Do you know what I mean? And yeah, I think those things are like super important. And I think also too, just stopping and thinking that like maybe the way I'm doing it isn't the way, and like maybe somebody else like has a cool idea, like maybe the perspective of somebody else, like, Keely and I have looked at things and often put a little note on things like, okay, who's like missing from this conversation, or who benefits from this conversation, who is, doesn't. Like, those types of questions are essential to multiplayer mode, and they come up more naturally when you have someone who like lives in a completely different circumstances than you. But if you make it a practice of asking those things, then you're going to get to solutions that like you could not come up with on your own.
What's funny, I was thinking too, it's an idea can come from anywhere. And what's funny about all of this is that it's all the same stuff that's in agency creds decks. That's like what people proclaim to be true of a culture, but isn't actually true of a culture, because it's not, it's still, to go back to our triangle, it's still sort of.
No, I'm gonna get roasted for that forever. But it's an org chart.
It's still born of a system, right? It's born of a way of doing things, and it's not, necessarily, if you know what you believe, you know how to behave. I don't know that it is always like translated into behavior, despite its presence in a culture deck.
So true. I think there's the aspirational, there's the version that makes, the PR headlines and the websites, but there's often a delta between what gets published versus what is enacted and what is rewarded inside organizations. So I think, psychological safety looks very different in every organization, as in the state of it. But we all know when people have it, right? We all know what it feels like, what it looks like when people actually have it. There's this other concept I was talking about earlier, not earlier in this conversation, but a different one, called the culture debt. In the tech space, there's a concept called tech debt, which is like the gap between whatever tech skills your organization needs in order to deliver on a vision, versus a culture debt is also being able to identify what you've left unnurtured and then it accumulates, and then you're seeing the impact in culture within your organization, and then you're able to see, obviously, that concept is called the culture debt.
It's fascinating.
And so I think what's interesting is like the words are there, the visions are there, but I think to enact them, there has to be real accountability and responsibility to like live it, breathe it, but also see the ROI. I hate to bring ROI into this, but to really value it beyond, I think, policies or beyond rituals, right? Like really commemorating them. So when you think about going back to future building, but future building from a place of co-ownership, multiplayer mode, what's one unmissable signal that we should all be watching, or an action we should be doing if we truly want to build more futures that are anchored in multiplayer mode?
We prepped for this and we're excited.
Yeah. Parties, not just because I personally like to party. Since 2004, there has been a 35% decrease in people attending parties. Shocking. Okay. And then a 2023 survey found that 1/3 of American adults were prepping for a doomsday scenario. Okay.
Which is probably higher now, let's be real.
Yeah.
Okay. So we were like, what if we were prepping for a party instead? We're feeling very hopeful that parties are on the up and up. There's a lot of signals around it. I really loved the way the New York Times covered not too long ago the Harlem rent parties that people used to throw when they couldn't make their rent. And so that has really, really cool inspiration for community and gathering. I think Keely and I are also, we both recently read The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. Yeah. And I think for us, when we look at a lot of the futures we want to build, that building a sense of community, like not just inside Radar, but with your neighbor and that type of real change, parties are important and gatherings important. And
how we gather is important.
Yeah.
We've seen like block parties coming back as a form of neighborhood activism, and stoop coffee and what it means to just exist, you know, to put your chairs out front, to shout out to Olivia Vigelos, one of our favorite designers. And also I would be remiss to not mention the fact that the All-American Rejects are out there actively changing our timeline by just showing up at house parties and giving Gen Z like an experience they've never had. Like these kids who don't know, like crowd surfing, like just like being with strangers and like having someone that lift you up. And just this idea, right? Like this idea of just like having an experience that is very, very neighborly and human and pro-social, and the reclaiming of that, just hanging out in this moment of collective effervescence. And I think that notion of, you know, I think Caitlin put it of, if we're going to build a future together, we need to party together. Because like, as a very antisocial human, I resist this notion, but I like it, and I will stand in the corner of the party against the wall while Caitlin.
We can be plus ones together. We'll do it.
Yes. Wow. Okay. On that note, thank you, Keely and Caitlin, for partying with me virtually.
It was a party.
Thanks for listening to the Unmissables with Ariba Jahan podcast. If today's conversation sparked something new or made you think differently, be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. And if you're enjoying the show, please consider leaving us a rating or review. It really helps more listeners find us. For past episodes, show notes, and the unmissables I'm paying attention to, subscribe to the newsletter on Substack or visit unmissableswithariba.com. See you on the next episode.